Today we're going to look at how to lay out a pattern properly. When cutting out a pattern, it's really important to know the right way to lay out the pattern, the right way to lay out the fabric, and what all the markings mean. On this particular pattern, we're going to look at the green line here, and this is telling you that is your natural bust line. The dotted lines are the sewing lines. Most patterns use a 5/8 inch seam, but you really need to read your directions because some of the newer patterns are only using a 3/8 inch seam, and that would make a big difference in the final fit of the garment. The black line on the bottom is a hemline. Of course, you'll use this in case you need to lengthen or shorten the piece because of whether you're short or taller. Grain lines tell you how your fabric needs to line up with the grain of the fabric. To make sure your garment drapes or stretches properly, you need to make sure your grain lines run parallel to the selvage. Now, the grain lines have a double arrow, so they have an arrow on the top of the grain line and an arrow on the bottom of the grain line. When you're laying out your item that needs to be put on the grain line, you need to have the selvages together, and then on the opposite side of the selvages, you will have a fold. Here, I use my grain line, and I measure 5 inches from the fold on the top part of my grain line on the pattern piece, and 5 inches from the fold on the bottom line of the pattern piece. And what you will do then is you will actually take a pin and pin it down on the top and the bottom of the grain line, so it doesn't move around as you finish pinning the rest of the garment piece down. There are certain pattern markings that are special that you need to know about. Pattern pieces with a double bent arrow line means that this part of the pattern piece needs to be placed on the fold of the fabric. So you'll have your selvages on one side and your fold on the other. And here, this is what this should look like. You want to be very careful never to cut any piece down the center where there is a fold line, because then all of a sudden your garment will not fit properly because you'll have to figure out a way of putting a seam there. Notches help you make sure that you can line up your adjacent pattern pieces in the correct place. And you will see here there's double notches and single notches. You can either cut the entire triangle out, or you can just do a snip to the triangle point. I like to use the snip to the triangle point. You just need to make sure that you don't cut into that sewing line, that it's less than that and it stays in your seam allowance. You will also see dots or squares, and these designate a point where other pattern pieces need to come together. On the top of this pattern, you can see this is the armhole, but you will see on the top right, that is where if you have a sleeve that needs to be fit in properly, that will match with the dot on the sleeve. You also, a lot of times, see them using dots or squares to line up the bottom of a zipper if you put a zipper in a garment. Fabric layout is very important. It's important to read your pattern directions to see how you must lay out your pattern pieces on the fabric. Here are some key terms you need to know. The selvage are the white things, or sometimes they're dark, on the side of each side of the fabric. And they usually are bound, and they look a little bit different than the rest of the fabric. When you put the selvages together, you'll have the fabric fold. Of course, this one is easy. This is the right side of the fabric, and this is the wrong side of the fabric. It's easy to tell because the wrong side of the fabric looks muted and it doesn't look as vibrant. It's easy also, like if you're doing a fake fur garment, the inside has no fur on where the outside has, the right side of the fabric has fur on. Sometimes there's a little bit of a different texture based on the wrong side of the fabric and the right side of the fabric. Let's take a look at laying out the actual pattern. The first thing you need to do is decide which view you're going to make. We're going to make skirt D with this example. Next, you'll take out the pattern instructions, and here you'll see it tells you the pattern, and we want to do pattern D. And it tells me all the pattern pieces and what they're for. And if I hide this here, you'll be able to see that we're doing pattern piece, we're going to do D, so I know I need 8. And I also know I need number 2 for the casing. But Don't worry too much about that. As you look further in the instructions, you will see the pattern layout for skirt D. And again, it tells you that you will use pieces 2 and D. This also tells me that this has selvages on both sides, so I don't have a fold, and they actually put the fold on the bottom. So it's folded differently than normal. And this is what it looks like. I have my selvage pieces, and on this piece of fabric, you can tell very easily they're white on both sides. You can see that on the right picture here. And I also put the fold at the bottom of my pattern piece. I also had to cut out my pieces separately because I need 4 pieces of pattern piece 8, and I need a skirt waistband of 2. And it tells you on the pattern, it's hard to see here, but it tells you on the pattern that's what you will need. When you cut your fabric, it's very important to use one hand, the hand that you don't cut with, and keep your fabric flat on the table, and then cut with your cutting hand. And cut as close as you can to the cutting line. Here, I actually used that hem line to hem up my skirt because I'm short and I need to take about 2 to 3 inches off of every garment I make. So I'm doing it before I actually make the pattern, or before I actually put the pattern pieces together. Never lift your fabric up off the table to cut it. The reason you don't want to do this is your pattern pieces will shift a bit and you won't have as nice of a fitting garment that the pieces come together as nicely. Before removing your pattern pieces to actually start sewing, you need to make sure to mark all of your marks. So you need to make sure you cut your notches. You need to make sure that you use a marking tool to mark all of your circles and your dots, and you'll see here what it looks like when you mark the circles. And also here they have you marking the center fold of your waistband piece, so you make sure it lines up properly. At this point, you are ready to sew. If you have any questions, please contact me.